For the first time ever, 4 astronauts are set to return home early from the ISS following a medical issue. Congress is about to undo NASA budget cuts for 2026. Impulse Space's space tug has an issue in space, and billionaires are buying space telescopes now? As always, we've got all that and more coming up this week in Spaceflight. The Crew 11 astronauts will return from the International Space Station early following a serious medical emergency with one of the 4 crew members. Now, this has never happened in the station's 25 years of operations, so let's take a closer look at the situation and what's next for the astronauts. Before we continue, NASA reports that the astronauts' condition is stable, but for privacy, the agency won't share details about which crew member is affected or the medical details of the situation. All we know, and all we need to know, is that it's one of the crew members of Crew 11 who launched last year on August 1st. The mission's commanded by Zena Cardman, who's accompanied by pilot Mike Fincke, mission specialist Kimiya Yui, and mission specialist Oleg Platonov. NASA first reported on the issue on Wednesday when it announced that a planned spacewalk would be postponed following a medical concern with one of the crew. The astronauts scheduled to perform the extravehicular activity, or EVA, were Crew 11's 2 NASA astronauts, Zena Cardman and Mike Fincke. A few hours before NASA's announcements, JAXA astronaut Kimiya Yui called Mission Control in Houston to request a private medical conference, or PMC.
Houston Station on space ground 2.
Station Houston on space ground 2.
Okay, I'd like to request a quick PMC and maybe space ground 4 or 3 for private time, please.
Okay, we'll put that in work and we'll do it on space ground 4. We will let you know when it's privatized and ready to go.
As that name suggests, the conversation that followed wasn't broadcast on a public channel. While uncommon, it's not the first time an EVA has been postponed due to a medical issue. In 2021, EVA 77 was delayed when astronaut Mark Vande Hei developed a minor medical concern, later reported to be a pinched nerve that prevented him from participating. Even more recently, a spacewalk was called off about an hour before the astronauts were due to exit the ISS after one crew member reported spacesuit discomfort during final checks and was later rescheduled out of an abundance of caution. The severity of the current situation became clear when NASA released a statement that it was considering the possibility of ending Crew 11's mission early. And that's pretty unprecedented. They've never cut a mission short for medical reasons. On top of that, Crew 11 was already set to return sooner than originally planned in late February, following rescheduling to accommodate the Artemis II timeline. Later in the week, newly appointed NASA Administrator Jared Isaacman announced that they had indeed decided to bring Crew 11 home earlier than scheduled, and with the crew member currently in stable condition, the primary reason is to get that crew member back on the ground where a full suite of medical equipment will be available for diagnosis.
I've come to the decision that it's in the best interest of our astronauts to return Crew 11 ahead of their planned departure.
Isaacman stressed, however, that this isn't an emergency return, as NASA isn't using its capability to return the crew immediately within hours. Fortunately, NASA is prepared for situations like these. You might recall back in June of 2024, NASA accidentally broadcast what appeared to be an emergency with the commander aboard the ISS.
So if we could get a commander back in his suit, get it sealed, and step into procedure 5.180 for suited hyperbaric treatment, section 3 for oxygen post-splashdown, that would be my recommendation.
Well, thankfully, this was just an exercise simulating an emergency in which a crew member suffered the effects of decompression sickness. Now, the exercise wasn't intended to be broadcast across the ISS livestream, but it does illustrate how astronauts and ground teams at NASA and its partners are trained and well prepared to deal with these scenarios. Now, the medical condition in that exercise, decompression sickness, would most likely occur on the station around the time of an EVA. And with the timing of this issue, it might seem that something similar could have happened. But NASA's Chief Health and Medical Officer, Dr. James Polk, stated that this wasn't the case, and that the incident had nothing to do with the fact that they were preparing for a spacewalk or with the operational environment.
This actually had nothing to do with the operational environment in preparing for a spacewalk at all. This was totally unrelated to any operations on board.
In terms of the specific timeline for the return of Crew Dragon Endeavour, we should expect another update soon. NASA and SpaceX will be conducting a standard return procedure, splashing down off the west coast of the US in a predetermined area. Preparations for the return seem to be on their way now, with an Airbus EC-225 helicopter typically involved in Dragon recoveries making its way to California. Meanwhile, SpaceX also seems to be preparing Dragon recovery ship Shannon for action. We will, of course, cover the return on our usual channels and on next week's episode. For now, our thoughts are with the crew member, and we wish them a speedy recovery. Throughout last year, we reported on political woes for NASA's 2026 budget, but it seems like we are finally nearing the end of it, and better yet, it's mostly good news. So what's actually going on? Well, in May of last year, the White House proposed slashing NASA's budget by billions, just over $6 billion in fact, which is almost a quarter of the nearly $25 billion that NASA was allocated for last year. Now, as you might imagine, the impact of these cuts would be felt throughout the agency's missions, centers, and programs, although they weren't equally distributed, and some programs were affected much more than others. NASA's science program budget was pretty much cut in half, and the agency's much smaller STEM engagement program would have been completely cut if it were up to the current administration. Meanwhile, NASA's Moon to Mars program saw a sizable increase. But back then, it was still just a proposal, and it had yet to be approved by Congress. Even though the calendar has now flipped to 2026, and the fiscal year actually started back in October, the budget for this year still isn't finalized. There's a whole bunch of political theater that we can thank for that, but that is far beyond the scope of our space news coverage. Regardless, Congress is working on finalizing the budget, and this week, the process reached an important milestone for NASA as the House and Senate Appropriations Committees released the final text of a bill that's supposed to set NASA's budget, among others. It appears that Congress rejected most of the Trump administration's proposed budget cuts, with this new proposal bringing NASA's 2026 budget to only slightly below what was enacted for 2025. Part of this was already enabled by the Big Beautiful Reconciliation Bill, which passed last summer after it got amended to allocate funds for some of NASA's programs. Under the new budget, most programs are nearly back to their 2025 funding, including the agency's science program. The exploration program, which includes Moon to Mars, also sees its budget increased compared to last year, but not as much as the administration wanted. STEM engagement even made a full comeback, which is really great, as these programs help to enthuse the next generation of engineers to focus their careers on spaceflight and other related fields, and without them, well, we wouldn't really have much space news to report on. Now, unfortunately, it's not all good news. After all, the overall budget is still decreasing compared to last year, so some things have to be cut. Although the Appropriations Committee allocated $110 million for future Mars missions, the Mars sample return mission is distinctly missing from the budget. This mission was supposed to bring samples of Martian rock and soil to Earth. The material was collected by NASA's Perseverance rover and carefully selected by a team of scientists for its scientific value. But it now seems that the samples will be left on the red planet's surface for quite a bit longer. It's not a big surprise, though. The ambitious Mars sample return mission concept had been under scrutiny for quite a while. Its cost kept increasing, while the date of the samples arriving back on Earth kept delaying. During his tenure as NASA administrator, Bill Nelson attempted to rescue the program by looking for alternatives, and companies like Rocket Lab and Lockheed Martin even chipped in their own ideas, but ultimately, it didn't save the mission. The current administration had been adamant about scrapping the mission, and it seems like they got their wish. The European Space Agency was a key partner in the mission's original architecture, and they even clearly saw it coming. The agency's plans for the next 3 years, presented at ESA's Ministerial Council meeting in late November, include a proposal to repurpose the Mars sample return parts for a European Mars mission. Whether Percy samples will ever find their way to Earth is just speculation at this point. China is planning a Mars sample return mission, so at least the scientific community will get some of Mars in their hands within the next few decades, but it's still a far cry from the wealth of scientifically interesting material collected by Perseverance that's waiting for a ride that may never come. Regardless, we are glad to see that many other NASA programs and missions will now see their funding mostly restored, even if there is still some left to wish for. It's not set in stone, though. The bill still has to pass Congress and be signed into law, and the House has already passed the bill, so that's a good start, and it's now up to the Senate. Either way, this new budget is a clear rejection of the current administration's intention to cut down on NASA, and that is great news for space fans. And if you want to know how NASA's final budget squares up, be sure to tune into future episodes, as we will definitely cover it. Subscribe to get notified when we publish, and give us a like to let the algorithm know that you think our space news coverage is worth watching. This week, a new space telescope was announced, but unlike most space telescopes, this time there's no space agency involved. Instead, this one is backed by a billionaire, and in many ways, it's positioned to follow in the footsteps of the venerable Hubble Space Telescope. Former Google CEO Eric Schmidt is behind the project through Schmidt Sciences, which he founded with his partner Wendy Schmidt. The organization is working on a larger program called the Schmidt Observatory System, which isn't limited to just one space telescope. It might have multiple space telescopes and will also encompass at least 3 ground-based observatories. 3 Earth-bound observatories have currently been announced, and this week, the Lazuli Space Observatory was added to the mix. The project has been underway for a while now, and its design was actually approved for construction mid-2025. So what will Lazuli be capable of? Its primary mirror will measure 3 meters in diameter, larger than Hubble's 2.4 meters. As a result of physics, this will allow Lazuli to resolve finer details, which is always ideal for astronomy. The telescope's instruments will observe the universe in visible and near-infrared wavelengths between 400 and 1700 nanometers. Although not a perfect match to Hubble's range, the capabilities are very similar. Lazuli will be outfitted with 3 instruments. First, there's its main imaging instrument, the Wide Field Context Camera. It will also feature a spectrograph, as well as a coronagraph, which will block out the light from other stars to help study exoplanets. The telescope will be launched into a high Earth orbit between 70,000 and 285,000 kilometers in altitude, where it will travel around our planet in 9 days. It might come online as soon as June 2028, which means we could see a launch in about 2 years from now. Now, the timing of the announcement is rather poignant. At the same conference where Lazuli was revealed this week, the American Astronomical Society's annual winter meeting, Hubble teams reportedly announced that the legendary space telescope is currently expected to re-enter around 2033, with a less than 10% chance of re-entering in 2029. The date depends on many factors, including space weather, so there are many uncertainties. Considering a Hubble servicing mission seems unlikely at this time, the telescope's end is quickly approaching, even though it's still one of the astronomy community's most valuable assets. However, Lazuli might be ready to step in just in time. While private funding might be relatively new to space telescopes, history is filled with examples of privately funded science. Lazuli won't even be the first private space telescope. Last November, SpaceX's Transporter 15 launched the privately funded MAVE telescope. It's much smaller, though, with its primary mirror coming in at 13 centimeters compared to Lazuli's 3 meters. Schmidt Sciences intends to make most, if not all, of the telescope's observations publicly available through open data policies. Now, as for who will launch Lazuli, we don't know yet. Although, you might also recall that Eric Schmidt bought Relativity Space last year, so if all goes well with Terran R, it might just get to carry a telescope in an upcoming payload. NASA has selected 7 technology studies to advance the Habitable Worlds Observatory, a future mission designed to search for life beyond our solar system. These 3-year fixed-price contracts will mature the critical hardware needed to directly image Earth-like exoplanets around nearby stars. To find and characterize potentially habitable worlds, the observatory would require an ultra-stable optical system capable of moving no more than the width of an atom during observations. Using an ultra-precise coronagraph to block out overwhelming starlight, the telescope would isolate the faint light from exoplanets in the so-called habitable zone where liquid water could exist. That light would then be split into spectra, allowing scientists to search for atmospheric signatures of water alongside key gases such as oxygen and methane. If promising signs are found, the observatory could probe further, monitoring those worlds over time for seasonal or longer-term changes that strengthen the case for life. As you'd expect for a flagship mission, the selections span the major aerospace primes, Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin, L3 Harris, and BAE Systems, alongside specialist companies such as Astroscale, propulsion experts Busek, and optical coating specialist Z-Coat. Together, these studies will lay the groundwork for one of the most ambitious astronomical observatories ever conceived. If realized, the Habitable Worlds Observatory could identify dozens of potentially life-bearing worlds within its first 5 years of operation and help answer one of humanity's oldest questions: are we alone? Meanwhile, another of NASA's space observatories has released a remarkable new time-lapse video of Kepler's supernova remnant. The Chandra X-ray Observatory was first launched in 1999 aboard Space Shuttle Columbia, and the new sequence draws on observations spanning more than 25 years, from 2000 through 2025. Kepler's supernova lies within our own galaxy, around 17,000 light-years from Earth, and was first observed in 1604. It's now understood to be the aftermath of a Type 1a explosion when a white dwarf star was pushed beyond its tipping point and detonated. The video blends X-ray data, shown in blue, with optical imagery from the Pan-STARRS survey, revealing how the expanding shock waves and stellar debris evolve over time. The fastest-moving material in the blast wave is seen at around 2% of the speed of light, while slower regions plow into denser interstellar gas. Decades in the making, the sequence gives scientists a rare close-up view of how stellar explosions shape their surroundings and seed space with the elements needed for future stars and planets. Now we'll take a look at some other stories across space, starting with some imminent destruction at a NASA facility. NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama is preparing to demolish 3 historic test and simulation facilities that played pivotal roles in the early U.S. space program. Work began in mid-December to dismantle the Neutral Buoyancy Simulator, a massive underwater tank built in the late 1960s. Astronauts and engineers used the facility to rehearse weightless operations and test hardware for missions including Skylab, the Space Shuttle, and Hubble. The Marshall simulator closed in 1997 when training moved to the Neutral Buoyancy Laboratory at Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas. 2 other historic structures are slated for controlled implosion no earlier than sunrise on January 10th: the Propulsion and Structural Test Facility, also known as the T-Tower, and the Saturn V Dynamic Test Stand. There's some strong Apollo heritage here. Facilities like the Saturn V test stand helped validate the rockets that first carried humans to the moon, testing structures and vibrations under launch-like conditions long before flight. As NASA prepares for a new era of lunar exploration under the Artemis program, the demolition of these structures marks the close of a historic chapter. The work is part of a broader, long-term modernization effort at Marshall that began 3 years ago, clearing inactive infrastructure and making way for future NASA projects. While these test stands will fall silent, their legacy lives on in every mission that they made possible and in the continuing journey from Apollo's first footsteps on the moon to humanity's return. While NASA prepares for its crewed Artemis II mission, the Indian Space Agency, ISRO, is aiming to fly 3 uncrewed missions this year for its own human spaceflight program, Gaganyaan. The first of these missions was scheduled for later this month, but in recent days it appears to have slipped to no earlier than March. The Gaganyaan missions will launch aboard India's Launch Vehicle Mark III, or LVM-3. The rocket most recently flew in December, carrying the Bluebird Block 2 satellite into low Earth orbit. ISRO later released onboard footage showing booster and payload separation. The first uncrewed mission will also be the first launch of the LVM-3 with a full crew escape tower. On board, a half-humanoid robot named Mira will conduct a series of experiments in microgravity while monitoring cabin conditions and testing crew interface systems. Her name comes from Sanskrit, Vyoma meaning space, and Mitra meaning friend, reflecting her role as a stand-in astronaut. Mira will help to validate the human rating requirements ahead of future crewed missions. ISRO expects its first crewed flight no earlier than next year, once the uncrewed test campaign is complete. If successful, India would become the 4th nation to independently send humans into orbit, after the United States, Russia, and China. Meanwhile, ISRO successfully completed a static fire test of an upgraded 3rd stage for its Small Satellite Launch Vehicle, or SSLV. The test on December 30th validated a lighter carbon composite motor case that boosts payload capacity by about 90 kilograms, along with upgraded ignition, nozzle, and fault-tolerant control systems. The test lasted 108 seconds and cleared the new stage for flight use. This marks another step in strengthening India's small-sat launch capability, alongside wider upgrades to the country's solid rocket manufacturing infrastructure that'll support both ISRO missions and India's growing private launch sector. As NASA prepares to roll out the SLS stack for the Artemis II mission, the 4th European service module for the program has reached the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. The module was built and integrated by Airbus in Bremen, Germany, under contract to the European Space Agency, and was shipped across the Atlantic last November. It's now housed inside the Neil Armstrong Operations and Checkout Building at Kennedy, where engineers will spend the coming months conducting tests and connecting it to the Orion crew module. The ESM is installed underneath the crew module, and together they they form the Orion spacecraft. The service module provides propulsion, electrical power, thermal control, and life support resources, effectively acting as Orion's in-space engine room during both the outbound and return phases of the Artemis missions. The arrival of ESM-4 marks a key milestone in preparations for Artemis 4, which is expected to include a crewed lunar landing and delivery of lunar IHAB, ESA's first module for the Lunar Gateway space station. For Europe, it secures a long-term role in human exploration beyond low Earth orbit. And speaking of the Lunar Gateway, this week NASA announced that its power systems have started up successfully for the first time, ticking off an important milestone. The station will be powered through the so-called power and propulsion element, which, unsurprisingly, will also provide propulsion. The module will be outfitted with solar arrays capable of generating 60 kilowatts of power, which will also feed into the module's electric thrusters. Lanteris Space Systems, formerly known as Maxar, is building the module. NASA reported this week that Lanteris powered on the module in its clean room sometime last year, proving that the system functions as intended and will be capable of providing Gateway with attitude control, communications, and power. NASA also reported that the module's rollout solar arrays are now completed and undergoing testing as well. Although more and more elements for Gateway are currently underway, the station's future still seems increasingly uncertain. Some politicians, including the current administration, seem eager to get rid of this costly program, but the US Congress has managed to save it for now, for example, through last summer's reconciliation bill, as we discussed earlier in the episode. Considering Gateway is a collaboration between multiple partners around the world, there's also some pressure to keep it going. For now, it's not clear who will win, but at least the hardware is underway and slowly getting ready for launch. Impulse Space has had a bit of an issue with the third mission of its Mira space tug. It launched last November on SpaceX's Transporter 15 mission, and initially, everything seemed fine. The spacecraft functioned as intended, deployed its solar arrays, phoned home, and did everything that you'd want to see from a newly deployed spacecraft. However, an issue was soon noted as the star trackers produced noisy measurements during the commissioning phase. The spacecraft uses these systems to determine its position and orientation in space, and it appears that the noise resulted in Mira making unnecessary corrections with its RCS thrusters, or as Impulse describes it, it led, quote, to higher RCS propellant expenditure than desired for this phase of the mission. Engineers solved the problem by disabling the star trackers, but by that point, Mira had burnt through the majority of its nitrous oxide supply. As a result, the space tug won't perform any main thruster burns, which is inconvenient for a spacecraft that is literally supposed to tow spacecraft to their final orbits. The spacecraft on this mission is the first of Mira's upgraded design, but we don't know whether that has anything to do with the noisy star trackers. Hopefully, they'll figure out what caused the problems before the next mission. Fortunately, Mira is still operating and healthy, so Impulse is now working with its customers to begin their missions. The space tug has already deployed 3 satellites in their target orbits, but Impulse didn't say anything about the impact on other customer payloads. This is your weekly space traffic report provided by Next Spaceflight. The year started off with a rather quiet week in which we had only a few Falcon 9 launches. The first was the launch of the Italian space agency's CSG-3 satellite, which lifted off from Vandenberg in California on January 3rd. The satellite is the third of 4 for the second generation of Earth observation satellites for the Cosmos SkyMed constellation, which specifically focuses on studying the Mediterranean with synthetic aperture radar. The mission was followed by a Starlink launch on January 4th, which not only delivered 29 more Starlink satellites to SpaceX's internet constellation, but also debuted a brand new booster, B1101. And closing out the week, we had another Starlink launch from Florida, which featured the veteran booster B1069 on its 29th mission. Going into next week, SpaceX has 2 more Starlink missions scheduled, both from Florida. On January 11th, we'll also have a Falcon 9 launch from Vandenberg, which is set to loft a small space telescope for NASA. The telescope, called Pandora, will study exoplanet atmospheres during its 1-year mission. Pandora will be accompanied during its launch by the 39 payloads of SpaceX's Twilight rideshare mission. In addition to the Falcon 9 launches on the schedule, it looks like we might also get a launch from India next week. The country's PSLV rocket will loft the EOS N1 Earth observation satellite into orbit alongside several rideshare payloads. We might also get a couple of launches from China next week, as well as the early return of Crew 11, but the details on those missions are sparse at this time. As always, we recommend checking in with the Next Spaceflight app and website to stay updated with the latest schedule changes. And that's your weekly update of spaceflight news. I'm Alicia Siegel for NSF, and we'll see you all again next week to recap this week in spaceflight.